Nice to see everything starting to green up. See some of the alfalfa coming up there through. So we'll see how things turn out. We didn't have a lot of snow cover for most of the winter. So we'll see if we're dealing with some winter kill. It didn't get super cold without the snow, but without any protection on it, might have some issues. This is a low spot in the field where we get standing water over winter and ice, and it even here the alfalfa probably got a little bit of winter kill, but for the most part it looks like it is coming up, so that's good to see. Alfalfa, and then obviously a bunch of grasses. It's a 80-20 Timothy blend with 3 pounds of brome per acre is what it's supposed to be. So we'll see what comes up. It almost looks like a bunch of the oats didn't winter kill, is kind of what it looks like. Just the way that some of it's coming up in rows. So we'll see what the first hay crop looks like when we get there. So up in the hay mow because I'm trying to record and actually say something, but it's seems like it's always windy outside these days, and with recording on this you just hear a lot of wind noise when I'm trying to talk. So we're up here in the mow. It's spring, so it's fairly empty up here. Our barn it's a bank barn with I think 6 mows, 6 sections in it that we store dry hay and straw in. Last year we just filled up a little more than one area with hay, so it was a little over 1,000 bales, I think maybe 1,100 bales of dry hay. We used a lot more than that, but we used some wrapped hay and some other feed. Wanted to talk about why our farm, you've probably noticed we're not grass-fed, not exclusively grass-fed, and wanted to talk about why we're not. And I mean, there's a number of reasons, but I guess the main one for us is the environmental impact of how we feed versus exclusively grass feeding. Right off the top, the main one is the methane production of grass-fed versus grain-fed. Because we're feeding those concentrates that are so much more accessible to the animal, it has to spend less time breaking it down and in the ruminating process. So like I think it's 85% of the methane that a cow produces is actually from it burping when it's trying to digest the hay, whereas only like 15% is actually out the back end of the cow. So in feeding it concentrates, it actually changes kind of the makeup of how they digest it a little bit. So they're actually putting off a lot less methane than an animal that is on a grass diet. And we feed some grass, it's just we feed a lot higher percentage of corn and soy meal, like different concentrates that are easily accessible to them. So that's part of it. Another part is kind of land dynamics. So if you think about a cow, if you wanted to have it on grass, but like here in Canada anyways, like we can't really pasture year round. They can be out in the field, but they're not likely to be able to graze year round. So you're probably feeding them hay for 6 months, maybe even more, depending a little bit on how the year goes. and I mean, to pasture a cow-calf pair, you need a couple acres of good pasture. If typically pasture land isn't good, so you need a number more acres to graze them on, and then you still need enough hay to feed them over the winter. So you're probably looking at close to another 2 acres of hay ground. So you need, if it's good sort of tillable land, you need 4 acres of land to raise one animal on. One cow-calf pair on the land, and that really only raises the calf up to 8-9 months before it moves off there. And typically in a cow-calf situation, it's going to go to a feed yard. If you're going to graze it, then it needs that much longer and that much more land. So you're looking at, just to get the thing to 8 or 9 months, you're looking at 4 acres for a year. Whereas with this corn-fed diet, we can take a calf right from coming off the bottle at a couple months, and we can take it all the way to finished weight, and we need to feed it about something in the neighborhood of an acre of corn, sort of an average yield for here, something in the neighborhood of about an acre. I have to think. Probably a quarter of an acre of hay, I would say. That's just ballparking it without actually doing too much calculation. And then, probably half, 3/4 of an acre of soybeans to soy meal. So you're looking at probably 2 acres to take an animal from just coming off the bottle to finished weight, as opposed to 4 acres, kind of best case scenario in my opinion, taking that calf to only 8 or 9 months. And then you probably, if you were going to grass fed that thing, you'd be at least another 4 acres the next year, I would think, to get it. 9 months, 12, because you'd be another probably year and a half to finish that animal on grass. So you're probably another, if you said 4 acres over a year, so you're probably a year at 8 acres to try and finish an animal on grass if you just break it down into a 1 year thing. Whereas here, and I'm probably making that a little confusing, whereas here with the corn fed, you're finishing an animal on 1 year's crop of about 2 acres. So when I think about it like that, like, you're probably 4, if not 5 times the amount of available land required to finish an animal on grass, as opposed to a corn-fed diet. And so that puts a lot more pressure on producing more land. So whether, that's like clearing more land, buying more land, you're just occupying a lot more space to try and finish those grass-fed animals. So that puts pressure on deforestation. That way I don't see it viable. If everybody went grass-fed, you'd need 4 times the acres to produce that amount of meat, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And that is, so in saying that, it takes almost twice as long and that was kind of built into that calculation of the number of land acres. It takes almost twice as long to finish a grass-fed animal as it does grain-fed. Your typical grain-fed animal, when it's ready to go, it'll be something in that 14 to 18 month range. Whereas with grass-fed, you're looking somewhere in the 24 to 30 month range to try and have a carcass that will grade in the same way that'll be equally as appealing to eat. So it's just, in my opinion, it's a fair bit less efficient, and it has a fair bit higher environmental impact to produce that quote unquote grass-fed animal. I mean, another thing I want to talk about with that is the kind of the notion of grass-fed is, I don't want to say, it's a little bit silly to me. And you know, I'm surprised I don't hear more people talking about this, even ones that aren't pro grass-fed, in that when a lot of people say grass-fed, what they kind of mean is not corn-fed. And they maybe don't realize that corn is a grass. So if you're feeding the silage, it would be kind of like feeding, it's different nutrient makeup, but a lot of the different grasses even have, if you looked at the nutrient profiles of different grasses, they have different makeups. So if someone's feeding corn silage, they're actually feeding grass in a sense, whereas someone who's feeding hay, they're maybe not really thinking about it in this way, but a lot of hay, like our field that we seeded last year, with it being 20% Timothy, 3% or 3 pounds per acre brome, like those are grasses. Like if I take a piece, like that's Timothy, and you got some brome there. Like that's what the seed heads on them look like. Like those are grasses, but then there's 80% alfalfa, and that sort of 20-80 split is a pretty normal hay blend. Well, the alfalfa is actually, technically it's a legume, so it's not really grass, and that's a typical hay. So, and I mean, there's other stuff like that too, like, so, like I said, alfalfa, if there's clovers, if there's peas, like any beans, any type of beans, canola, like any of the oil seeds, I think they're all legumes. And then if you got any turnips or like kales, brassicas, like anything like that, like they're their own class of thing too. And like a lot of well-managed pasture land has a lot of these legumes and brassicas in it, which are technically not grasses, whereas corn technically is a grass. And you would have the grass-fed farmer trying to argue that, well, they're feeding grass when really they're feeding a lot of other things, important things in my opinion, but not grasses, whereas someone who is feeding corn is technically feeding a grass. And so it's just, I find that a little bit funny, and there's these kind of drawing these lines and saying grass-fed, not grass-fed, and what's super important about that, and really it's a lot broader and nuanced than what's being said. And that if you were just going on, like if I just fed, so like horses, to feed horses, they would eat typically a lot of actual grasses, because the legumes and brassicas are too rich for them. So this would be grass-fed hay. But if you raise cattle on just these grasses, the nutrient profile of them is a lower, it's not as rich in nutrients as when you start adding those legumes and brassicas, because they have a lot of the protein that helps the cow produce the milk, that helps the animal being fed to finish to put on the weight. So I guess that's to say, a lot of, if you were to feed on just grasses, you're not going to get a very well daily average rate of gain, I guess you would say. It's not going to grow particularly well. It's not going to put on marbling like you might like to see. Certainly certain times of year when the grasses are just starting out, they're fairly rich in nutrients, but by the time you get into the later season grasses or into a hay product, Like your average hay like this is only probably 12% protein, and you want to see something a fair bit higher than that for trying to finish cattle. Um, so having more than just grass-fed to me is important for producing good, healthy, efficiently, and environmentally friendly raised animals. Which, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that feeding corn is like feeding Timothy or brome. Like, there's a very different nutrient profile in both of those feeds. Corn has a lot more energy than the other two. Wood is a dried feed. Um, but it's just, to me, sort of these arbitrary dividing lines of, well, all of a sudden corn is bad and grass is good. Um, it it's very arbitrary. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. That's the dividing line, and that people are so militant about, oh, it has to be grass fed. Like, you would see a lot of people feeding like wrapped haylage, where it'd be like the like spring cereals, like a rye or like an oats and peas blend, triticale, like something like that. These seeded grasses, which are going to have their annual crops, which means you have to plant them every year. Um, like, someone's going to call that hay, and it's just as close to corn as it is to like the Timothy or the brome. Um, it's just it just really seems like there's people have classed corn as not grass and everything else is fine, and I don't understand I guess you'd say, propaganda about why corn is so bad and everything else is okay, um, when it provides such value to feeding those animals. So, like, if you look at this is some chaff from our hay up here, from this year's hay. Like, it's good, like, clean hay. It was baled in a high quality for what it is. But if you were to think about this in the human equivalent, like, this is probably a lot more like your iceberg lettuce, and that there's stuff there, but it's not nearly like if you were feeding some spinach or um, like some romaine or something. It's a lot darker green. It's good for the cow, but it's not necessarily going to meet all of the nutritional requirements of the cow over the winter. So, like, even if we're feeding our herd some of this hay, but then we have to make supplements available to them because we want them to be healthy and to grow well, and because they're bred cows, we want the calf inside them to develop well, and just feeding this hay won't necessarily get the best result. Like, the protein and the protein and the energy levels in this won't be particularly high, and that's because it's grass. And even at this point, with this hay being almost a year old, the vitamins in it will be, like vitamin A especially, will be relatively low compared to what they need. So feeding additional supplements to give them those nutrients is important. So the field that this came out of is fairly well spent. It's actually gonna be used to raise some corn silage this year. there's only a little bit of legumes in the field, but you can see a little bit of alfalfa in there, but it's mostly grasses. But I mean, another thing I guess I would say about the hay is that like they will eat this hay fine, they'll eat it up, but if I offer them this versus like a corn silage, or even like a high proportion legume hay, you can smell the difference between them if there's a lot of clover or alfalfa in it as opposed to a grass hay. If I'm offering them alfalfa versus grass, they're more likely to go for the legumes. It's just more desirable to them. So I guess I would say that's another part of it, is that cows don't necessarily prefer the grass hay. They'll prefer fresh grass as long as they haven't been having fresh grass all the time. If they've had fresh grass the whole time, they'll probably prefer the legume hay. But they'll more likely, if it's kind of spring like it is now, they'd go for the legumes over, or they'd go for the fresh grass over the legumes, if that's what they've had the whole time. But generally something richer than this type of hay is what the cow wants. And then from sort of a regenerative agriculture perspective, it's like there's definitely a value in raising cattle on pasture and the impact that they have on the soil quality of the pasture. But there are kind of ideal ways to do it and less ideal ways to do it, and the more ideal ways take a lot of labor, and so you see a lot fewer farmers actually using those practices. So what I'm talking about is sort of something like strip grazing, is kind of the better way to improve the soil quality while using pasture. But that means moving cattle a lot, and that means making sure that they have access to water in moving them around like that. So most people that are doing grass-fed aren't making use of those practices. So the soil benefits of those cattle being on pasture aren't as high as they could be for grass-fed animals. Whereas for us, we collect the manure then in a pile, and we'll spread that. And so we're adding those microbes and nutrients to our soil that way. So it's not like we don't have those benefits from not having those cattle out on pasture. We're still harnessing those nutrients. And then in terms of building soil quality, like we're moving to no-till this year. We're using a lot of cover crops that will help build our soil and try to get results similar to what some of the regenerative ag guys are doing that rotational or strip grazing. So there are different ways to achieve those soil health results without just doing it one way. And I think that if you do grass-fed well, that you can achieve those results that way, but you can also achieve those results by doing corn-fed, and as long as you're doing it well.